Welcome to the Handheld Book Club. Very nice to see you here, a small but intimate group. We're going to be talking to David McKay of Open Book Translation, who is a translator of Jan Jacob Slauerhoff's Het leven op aarde, which we have called Adrift in the Middle Kingdom. And we will also be talking to Arie Pos, who teaches in Portugal, who is a Dutch translator, when he joins the group. Because Arie and one of my colleagues, Wendy Gan, from the University of Hong Kong, they shared the work of writing the introduction to Adrift in the Middle Kingdom, but David did the translation. So I think we'll begin at the very beginning. So David and I worked together before because I was asked to mentor him in translating Oorlog en Turpentine, which is a Flemish novel about the First World War. Because in my previous life, I was a First World War historian. I taught at the University of Ghent in Belgium, so I have a lot of the background that was needed. So David and I worked on that, and that was really, really good. I thoroughly enjoyed it as a working experience, even though we'd never met. And then when I set up this publishing company several years later, I told David about it. I told all my friends about it. And then David presented me with this proposition. How about doing translation of Slauerhoff's Het leven op aarde?
Actually, I think it was a little more complicated.
Go on.
I think it was a little more complicated than that. I think you asked. You came to me and you asked me what books I was interested in translating, and I gave you a few ideas, and you were interested in exploring some of them further. I think you were a little lukewarm about all of them. I was lukewarm about some of them myself. And then I think you started looking at brochures from the Dutch Foundation for Literature. And I think it was in one of their brochures that you found the Slauerhoff book, and you asked me about it and said, hey, would this be an interesting thing to translate? And then, then I became very enthusiastic, and I said, why didn't I suggest this one in the first place? And yeah.
Okay, well, that brings me to the question: how did you come across Slauerhoff? When did you first read him, and why were you so wildly enthusiastic?
Well, I think if you're interested in Dutch poetry at all, or if you're interested in the history of Dutch literature at all, you bump into Slauerhoff. I mean, he's a very big name and known best as a poet. I brought some of my books here just so I can hold them up and show their thickness and seriousness. So you have this book of his collected poems is quite a bit thicker than both of his two novels put together, 808 pages or something in the Dutch edition. And then there's a I think it's from the 90s, early 90s, something like that, this biography of him, which is also
good Lord,
quite thick. So he's taken very seriously by people who are interested in the history of Dutch literature, and best known as a poet, and that's how he thought of himself too. So these are really poets' novels, which has been kind of a theme for me. I don't actually translate a great deal of poetry, but I've translated a lot of novels by poets. So
okay, yeah. But had you read Het leven op aarde when we started talking about it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So
go on.
One side of my wife's family is very literary, and she had the book already when I came to the Netherlands. So when I was learning the Dutch, it was one of the books on our bookshelf, and I picked it up at one point and read it for the first time. And at that point, I was still struggling with the language, so it was difficult. But I did come back to it later once I could appreciate it more. Yeah.
Yeah. Goodness me. Okay. So you were wildly excited at the prospect that I might possibly be interested in publishing it. And then you translated the first chapter, I think, certainly the first page or two.
Yeah.
And that hooked me.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the first chapter, this is something that Arie wanted to talk about. So I'm going to do a quick screen share now so we can look at the first paragraph or so. So if you can see, oh, by the way, hello, Babette. I know you're
there. Sorry, I'm late.
It's okay. It's okay. Good to have you with us. Yeah, the first two paragraphs, as you can see them here, this is the layout of our edition.
Yeah.
They're so literary, but you are plunged into a new world, which I found so attractive and so interesting. I wanted to find out what was happening and where we were. Can you talk a bit about the translation process, David? How you got the mood?
Yeah, this is actually these first two pages are actually Slauerhoff kind of strutting his stuff. So it's this long descriptive passage where he really is trying to demonstrate how vividly and how with how much color he can write, um, and really several pages of dramatic description before he moves on from this. One thing you see here is how there's, let's see if
Let's scroll down.
there's an example I really like a little lower on the page. Yeah. So, which is really characteristic, even more than in this beginning section, but throughout the book, of a kind of thing Slauerhoff likes to do. He says there are newborn babies among them, chubby and soft as little mollusks. Their big brown eyes wide open and mild in their tiny faces. So it's it, it's sort of a charming description of these little newborn babies, except for this word mollusks in English. And in Dutch, in fact, there's a word for soft, which means soft in a kind of unpleasant way, which is week. And mollusks are called weekdieren. So in Dutch, you get a repetition of the word week and then the word weekdier after that. He makes you look at these babies in a very different way from usual. He takes our tendency to look at babies as these cute, soft little things, and then he turns that softness into something negative. They're not soft like cute little cuddly toys. They're soft like little mollusks.
Yeah, they're boneless and they're skinless and they're vulnerable, but they're also very unpleasant to the touch. You're right. It's a real contrasting set of images just in that one word.
Yeah. So there are these images throughout the novel. I mean, and they're both just powerful images in themselves, and well worded, well presented, poetic, but also strange and the opposite of what you might expect. There's a scene later in the novel where he compares camels who are drowning as waters rise. There's a boat that's been grounded because the waters fell too low. So, and they're trying to pull the boat out of the water. And as these camels are pulling the boat out of the waters rise again, and they have to leave some of the camels there to drown. And he describes these camels drowning in the water as being like dying swans. With their long necks. So it's drawing your attention to a visual image, but making you see that in a very surprising way, that you don't think of camels as being like swans at all. Yeah.
Yes, the audio is a juxtaposition of really something quite horrific with beauty and picturesqueness in a sense of an arranged scene. That does come up quite often. There is something that you and I had a lot of discussions about. I'm going to quickly rush on. It's bit where we've got the child prostitutes, because this I found really, really strange. There's this moment here, the narrative voice, who we don't really get a name attached to for some chapters, he's surveying the scene on this ship, and he's immediately visualizing this young woman. But then he decides, actually, no, I won't. But you still have the possibility there exposed that all the women on the boat are there for the men to take advantage of as they want, when they like. And it's possibly slightly unusual that this man holds back and decides, no, I won't do this. And he does this again and again. So the sense of restraint, but it's restraint which is odd. So although the outcome in moral terms is quite good, he's not going to exploit the vulnerable woman again and again. The fact that he chooses not to is, it certainly presents itself to us as this is rather strange behavior for the norms of the time. And that tells us so much about the character and also about the temporal setting and the social setting he's in, all through the single 2 or 3 examples of his interaction with women who he decides or doesn't decide to sleep with.
Yeah, and here it seems to position him less as a hero. I mean, superficially, as you said, it's a you might see it as a laudable thing to do, but he's more of an anti-hero, as though he's too disgusted with society, or feels too detached from society to engage in this.
or
Yeah.
doesn't want anything to do with these Chinese peasant women
Yeah.
because they're beneath him, or the reasons in his own head are not positive.
Yeah,
But
I think the character who needs to be distinguished from Slauerhoff, but I think that the character at this point in the book has an idea of in his mind that he's going to find some place untouched by modernity, and he
yeah,
sees these coastal cities in China as corrupted by modernity, corrupted by industrialization, corrupted by the West, and so he wants to flee somewhere in the inland China where he thinks he'll find some kind of primeval purity and that he has these notions of kind of which are encouraged, which have to do with Chinese literature too. In Chinese literature, there is also this tradition of thinking that off there in the countryside somewhere there is this kind of pure, untouched, bucolic life.
yeah. I should have asked at the beginning. I know Amy has not read this book because she bravely admitted it. Nina, have you read Adrift in the Middle Kingdom? Not at all.
No, no.
Okay, Laura, what about you? Do you know it?
No, I too have not read it.
Okay, and Babette, what about you?
Oh, I'm afraid not. It sounds intriguing. Would love
Okay,
to.
so 4 of you have no idea what this novel's about. Right.
This is working very well to encourage me to purchase it after the book club, though.
Okay, good.
Excellent.
Well, David, maybe you can outline the novel and the setting and where we're beginning from. What's going on?
Okay, so let's see. He's at the coastal city of Amoy here, and Slauerhoff himself was also a medical doctor, and for a long time he worked on ships. So he was a ship's doctor. So he had a lot of experience of visiting, and he mostly worked on tours of ports in Asia. So, and these were not cruise ships or places where there were lots of, ships where there were lots of middle-class families or anything like that. So he was the one educated person on the ship, maybe, or maybe the other educated person would have been the radio operator, because you had
Oh, you've
to be an
frozen.
engineer in those days, to be a radio operator. And in fact, that's what the main character of this book is he is a ship's radio operator. So Slauerhoff has made a character who's not identical to him, but in a similar position, and being he's on the ship, but he's a little bit separated by his background from the other people there. And so Slauerhoff often visited the city of what was then known as Amoy, and I have to say I've forgotten what the contemporary Chinese name is.
I can't remember.
And also Shanghai, which plays a major role in the book and is called by a fictional name in the book. It's called Tai Hai in the book, which it never was in real life. And the book is set in the late 20s, and it's set right at the time that the civil wars in China, the series of civil wars that led to the communist revolution eventually were starting up in China. And at this point, the Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and the communists were allies. And they were fighting against the old regime. They were also fighting against Japanese occupation in part of China. So, and in fact, the character ends up in Shanghai just at the moment that those two groups, that the communists are betrayed by the nationalists, basically. But that's not a major plot point in this book. But it's interesting that Slauerhoff is writing about what's going on just outside of Shanghai at just the moment that this was also happening, and in fact also a moment when the American Nobel Prize winning author Pearl Buck was in Shanghai too, and who also was one of the few other authors to write about working class life in China at this time. Yeah, one of the few other Western authors to write about that. Yeah.
So the narrator is Cameron. We've eventually find out his name. He's supposed to be an Irishman, but an Irishman with the name of Cameron is a Northern Irish Protestant at this period, because you won't get a Catholic called Cameron. And it's pretty unlikely. So Slauerhoff has deliberately chosen a foreign name and a foreign culture and a foreign religious affiliation, which has something to do with the way the character evolves, I think, because the restraint I talked about before is also self-denial, almost Puritanism. That comes through a lot in the narrative voice as that narrative character progresses. But this is a picaresque novel, really, because you go with the character through the most extraordinary happenings, events, meet people. There is a kind of a plot, but it's pretty tenuous. The book is about China, traveling through, sailing through China, and everything that Cameron sees and the people who he encounters and travels with. It all builds up into this sort of torrent of experience. And then it ends with a rather fantastical episode. The last chapter is fantasy, absolute fantasy. It's amazing.
Yeah, yeah, and it moves more and more towards that as the book goes on, and then there is a huge jump right at the end into complete fantasy. But it moves more and more towards and that's partly, I think, because Slauerhoff he had visited China himself. He wanted to write about his own experiences there. He wanted to write. He had read a lot of eyewitness accounts of things that were going on in the civil conflicts there, the military conflicts, and he wanted to write about that. But he also wanted to write about Chinese ideas, Chinese philosophy, Chinese literature, Chinese legends, and engage with those. And so as the book goes on, he moves more and more from, it starts out as a very gritty, realistic novel, and you have this very gritty description of a port city, and Cameron catches some of his shipmates selling drugs and is able to use that fact to extort money from one of them so that he can escape this life on board and go try to find this rural Chinese paradise that he believes in. And so he first uses that money to go and travel to Shanghai. And in Shanghai, it's all very realistic too, and you get a very vivid portrayal of the kind of neo-colonialism that was going on in China then. These quasi-colonialist European settlements there, and of opium smoking in Shanghai, and also of the hostilities there. And he's actually trapped outside the city in one of the worst hit suburbs during the military conflict. So you have some very grim descriptions of pestilence and plague and violence there.
That episode when he's stuck outside Shanghai waiting for the siege to be lifted or the hostilities to stop is almost the most peaceful and benign episode in the whole novel, because he's happy, he's at rest, he's in a place where no one's going to attack him, no one's going to rip him off. Dreadful things happen, but it's an oasis of calm. It's very strange. It's again this strange contrast between degradation and purity in the same space, and they coexist, and we just have to get on with it. It's a very curious effect. But
and that's I wonder to what extent that comes partly from his engagement with Chinese ideas. I mean, for one thing, he himself was was in very poor health all his life. He was asthmatic as a child. He caught tuberculosis early in his adult life and was wrestling with that for many years, and had all kinds of complications from both of those things. And he died quite young. So throughout his life, he was aware that he probably would die young. He was aware of illness as this kind of perpetual fact of life. So that really colors his writing. He has this view of human life where suffering just permeates human life, and there's no escaping it. And there's there's a nice sentence in this book, which I've got here. Yes, I knew very well this life was nothing more than a wallow in the muck, whooping and shouting to drown out your own despair, your shame, and your transgressions for the sake of mere survival. Yet I longed to become part of it. And there's this constant sense in the book that if you accept life on its own terms, on its own horrifying terms, that then there's this incredible beauty in it, and that goes right back to the level of the metaphors he uses too. That there's that if you accept that life is ugly, that life is full of suffering, and that there's no escaping that, then all of a sudden you have room for these moments, these openings, these moments when you can be together with other people, when you can appreciate nature, when you can appreciate wandering the world and seeing these surprising things you never expected. Yeah.
There is so much beauty in this novel. It's just rich with extraordinary things to look at and bizarre situations, which, as you say, could so easily have been taken from Chinese legend. because the further Cameron gets away from Shanghai, because he goes on a journey with a group of people, the more into the past he seems to be traveling. And once you reach the end of the novel, and as David has said, it becomes quite obvious the fantasy elements are beginning to creep in the further he gets into China and the interior. And it's an invented interior, because he goes to something he calls the Forbidden City. Is that right, David? Have I got this right? The name of the city that
he does refer to it as the Forbidden City. It will.
Yeah. But it's a city he describes as being built outside the Great Wall of China. So it's a city that never existed. So Cameron invents this and he reorganizes Chinese geography. And it's a fantasy place with a fantasy history, which is very, very important in Cameron's first novel, which was called, I've forgotten the title,
The Forbidden Kingdom. Yeah.
Yes. So this novel, Het leven op aarde, Adrift in the Middle Kingdom, is not his first novel. The first novel, The Forbidden Kingdom, which is also available in English, I think Pushkin Press published the translation.
Right. Yeah.
Is completely different. But the lead character ends up in this extraordinarily invented city in the hinterland of China, and that's in the medieval period. And in the modern day, Cameron goes to the same destination. So both novels end up in the same place. It is an extraordinary imaginative achievement. There's only a couple of years between the books. Is that right, David?
That's right. Yeah. He was very productive around that time. He was producing a huge number of poems to stories. So that was really the peak of his productivity around this time. So he also loved playing with genre conventions and different ways of writing and engaging with all the different kinds of things he wrote. So the character of the novel, in terms of how it's being written, varies a lot from point to point too, and you have this gritty realist style at some point, and then he changes into a kind of Hollywood hard-boiled style at one point when Cameron gets involved with a drug boss, basically in a gangster boss in Shanghai, in this fictional Shanghai called Taihai, and it's this gangster boss who sort of rescues him from this life in the coastal cities and says, okay, you can come with me and on this caravan into the interior if you'll and be one of my basically it's a weapons run is what they're doing. So they're bringing illegal weapons to this city.
And then you have fantastical elements with traveling players and secret agents, and then I don't know if you've ever seen, there's an old Chinese, not very old, a Chinese film I saw in my 20s, so it's 30 years old now, called Raise the Red Lantern by Zhang Shu, I think. The landscape of that film, it reminds me so much of what Cameron was describing, or Slauerhoff was describing in Adrift in the Middle Kingdom, because it's central China, growing sorghum, very, very soggy underfoot. He knew his China, he really did. And how did I get onto that? There was a reason. I've lost myself in a tangent.
Well, what I wanted to say at this stage is that that there's this clear distinction that you can make throughout the novel. I think, as I mentioned before, between the character and the author, because and that actually brings a little more humor in the novel, because you can see Cameron is kind of a sad sack, as getting in his own way. Cameron's always thinking that he's going to escape things. He is coming up with these bold plans to escape, and thinks he's going to escape into, primeval China. He thinks he's going to escape the world through opium. He thinks he's going to escape by becoming enlightened. And so he has all these kind of Western fantasies about China and what it's going to do with him, do for him. But at the same time, you see in the course of the novel that none of those pan out, and he keeps trying these things, and they do nothing for him. And in fact, there's a lot of irony where he goes to this city in inland China, far away from the coast, far away from Western civilization, and he brings Western civilization with him. And he's the agent of destruction in many different ways, not just in one way. I mean, so it starts with bringing these modern weapons there. which are which are also, you know, coming in from the West. And you can read the book. There is a serious critique of the Western arms industry looking for new places to sell their weapons. The drug industry and you know, the Western attempts to control China through the opium industry and to control China for the sake of the opium industry. So there's and even visions of environmental destruction that are connected to industry in there. So it's a prescient book in that way, and there are really these visions he has of, you know, beautiful rural places that, and he stands there and he thinks, oh, I see how this will all be destroyed by factories, by machinery. So.
And there is a remarkable episode where the warlord in charge of the city, when he finds out that Cameron is a radio officer, he says, build me a radio. So Cameron is faced with this impossible task of having to build a radio from scratch in what is basically a medieval city, which has never had anything more. I mean, the guns are brand new. They're working out what to do with the guns. So Cameron roams around the city. He's allowed to go to some places, but not others. He has secret helpers. He finally puts together all the bits to make a rudimentary radio set. And I don't do radio. I don't do technology in that way. I was really impressed at this particular feat. And then he gets it working to an audience of the warlord and his advisors and his nobles. And you hear Hitler. You hear Hitler over the radio waves doing a ranting speech in Nuremberg or whatever, because it's the 1930s.
Yeah,
No,
I forget whether it's in that same scene, but I think when he's assembling the radio himself, the first thing he hears is communist propaganda. So there's communist propaganda, there's fascist propaganda, and there's capitalist schlock coming through the radio too. You know, then they get, you know, rinky-dink popular music coming through it, which none of the Chinese know what to make of. And
so it's an intrusion of modernity through the airwaves. It's not physical, it can't be seen. It's just these mad sounds, which could be demons. And that's what one of the old priests thinks is happening, that Cameron has brought demons into the city. So you get this extraordinary combination of modernity as the reader knows and recognizes it, and the fantasy response. It's so clever. It's the more I think about this particular aspect of the combination of realism and the fantastical and the modernistic techniques. He was doing very clever things, Slauerhoff was. Yeah, it was brilliant.
Yeah, and it's a real commentary too, showing a way of one of the many ways in the book in which the author is saying, look, I am not this main character. I am not selling you China as a place where you can escape modernity, or a simple place, or a place of myth and legend, and in fact, I mean, it's connected to. So there are some recent books. There's a book that Michelle Hutchison, who just won the Booker Prize, the International Booker Prize for her translation, is translating now a big recent Dutch novel, which is all about the tourist industry and the damage the modern tourist industry has done in Europe. And in some ways, this is sort of on that theme too. It's about these Westerners traveling to exotic places and in the course of that actually bringing destructive new ideas and destructive new influences with them.
Yeah. I think the time has come for a few questions. Has anyone got any questions at all about the book, the author?
Well, I did have a question about, because Kate, you had mentioned that you mentored David on a translation earlier, and now you have a publishing company. Don't know that much about it. I read about this event. And how involved were you then in going through the translation or the editing process or that kind of thing?
Let me think. Well, David sent me the first drafts, and then I worked on them in that I said, well, this word, not sure about this. My knowledge of Dutch is not good enough to compare. I could not possibly do that, but I do. At that point, I used to have conversational Dutch. I don't anymore because I live in England now. So I did have the original text, so I could compare words and think, maybe that's not right, but most of it was just polishing the English or suggesting a little more fluidity. Or David would ask me, what do you think about this image? I need an image or an idea that suggests this. What can you bring in? So it was really as a polishing editor, but nothing more deep than that. David was the translator. But David, you and Ari had some conversations, didn't you?
That's right, and Ari was actually kind enough to read the whole book, and he's translated this book into Portuguese himself. So he's the main translator of Slauerhoff into Portuguese, and he's translated much more Slauerhoff than I have. He's translated both of Slauerhoff's novels, a lot of his poems, and he's also a Slauerhoff scholar. He's a teacher, and he's done research on Slauerhoff's travels. So he's written a book about Slauerhoff's travels in China, and he can actually point to which scene was based on what Slauerhoff did in which year. So if he were here, you would get a lot more details about the historical background to this book. But yeah, he's the real expert on that, and he found a lot of useful things. Yeah. So that was it was great to be able to work together with him.
Yeah, but it seemed to be a really smooth process because the text that David gave me in the first instance was pretty much complete. It was purely a matter of polishing because it just seemed to flow, really.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that you did, Kate, was you took the initiative, first of all, to figure out where we needed to add notes, where you did background, where we needed more background information. And
I have a passion for notes. All the handheld classics have notes that I write because I'm very keen on explaining things to people, and I'm very aware that people a lot younger than me may not have the cultural references, may not have the biblical background, say, or the classics background, whatever. So I'm very keen to explain as much as I think is necessary for students, just in case.
Yeah. And we have there, so there is a great set of notes in the back now that gives a lot of the context you need to follow what's going on. And there are two introductions too. There's an introduction there, which I think Kate mentioned earlier. So there's really it's a book where you benefit from that. The more you know about the context, the more you know about how it came into being. The more interesting it is to read. Yeah.
Yeah, my colleague Wendy Gan at University of Hong Kong, she wrote the China side of the introduction about how Slauerhoff's vision of China and his creation of China in this novel, how that relates to the real historical China, and different aspects of Chinese culture and society, and what he's picked up on, and also what he has not done, what he has omitted to change or omitted. So that was extremely helpful too. That was a good bit to read. Yeah. Any other questions?
I'm just wondering, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Babette.
Hi. I'm wondering, is there interest in China for this book? Has it, English, or has it been translated in Chinese? I mean, what do the Chinese think about it?
Well, as it happens, last week because we, for the first time, we had a presence at the Frankfurt Book Fair, which is the major international book fair for translations and for selling rights. I had a very slight presence there, but because of that, a Chinese rights agency got in touch, and today I sent them the PDF of this novel plus a couple of others that they're interested in. So it's possible they'll want to take it on and translate it. I mean, if they want to translate directly from Dutch into Chinese, they can do it whenever they like because it's in the public domain. But if they want to use the English, then hopefully we'll get a little something for David to as part of his translation.
Brilliant.
So we'll see. We don't know yet.
I'll be interested to find out what happens to it.
Oh, very much, yes. I think, yeah, if I know that the Chinese have published an edition because they've paid for the rights or whatever, then I'll be trumpeting it on the website and in our newsletter. So the news will come out that way.
Very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very exciting. I mean, as a translator, your main motivation is that you want this book that you love to reach more people. So to hear that it might end up in China is a wonderful thing.
Well, it's amazing that it hasn't already. But then Dutch literature it's a minor literature for countries that don't speak Dutch and for whom English might be the second language. So it's maybe not surprising. It's been
I'm also wondering, I mean, I grew up in the Netherlands and went to school there. And of course, I heard the name Slauerhoff, absolutely. But I cannot recall reading or being made to read anything by him. I have a vague idea that he wrote a lot of poetry. Are there poems?
Yeah, he's best known as a poet. Shall I read the poem now? We don't have Ari here to read the Dutch, but we
No,
had
you read the
prepared.
poem. Read
Yeah.
a poem.
Okay. So this is a translation of one of his best known poems, and it's also very much in keeping with the themes of the novel. And it was written in the same year, or either written or published in the same year, but written around the same time anyway.
Can you read it?
And the poem is called Homeless.
Right.
The only home I have is in my poems. No other rooms await me when I tire. I never longed for my own parlor fire, and all my tents were snatched away by storms. The only home I have is in my poems, and I can brave the deepest wilderness, steppe, city, wood, and never come to harm, as long as I can find my hearth in this. It won't come quickly, but the time will come when at day's end I'll feel my power take flight and plead in vain for words with which I might have built a home before, and then the ground will have to shelter me, and I'll bow down to where my grave breaks open in the night. So, yeah. So he's in poetry. He mostly writes in traditional forms, which is where Dutch poetry was at that time. Writes a lot of sonnets, but he was also very influenced by the translations from the Chinese of Arthur Waley, who was a member of the Bloomsbury group.
Mhm.
So there's a real connection to British modernity there. And in fact, these translations from the Chinese, both Arthur Waley's and also Ezra Pound's later, made a huge contribution to the birth of modernity in the UK and throughout Europe. Really, what you see is that these Asian influences coming in, especially Chinese and Japanese influences coming in, lead to different ways of thinking about writing, different ways of and lead people to experiment in dropping forms, doing things that are more like free verse. So I think in the novel too, you see a kind of what Ezra Pound called imagism. So you see a kind of focus on paring things down, a very spare style that really focuses on trying to communicate the essence of one striking image. Just finding a few words that just sort of brand this image indelibly in your mind. Yeah. So.
Well, the haiku comes to mind, as does Ezra Pound's "The Wet Faces on the Black Bow," the Paris Metro line, which is the classic thing you teach imagism with. Does Chinese poetry have the same kind of focus on? I'm just wondering if Slauerhoff ever read Chinese. Well, did he read Chinese at all? Do you think
he learned a little bit of Chinese, and I just found out today, because I was looking through the biography preparing for this, that he learned Chinese from a man named von Gulik, who became well known for writing a series of detective novels that became very popular in the UK too, in translation. Robert von Gulik, and he later went into the diplomatic service. He started out as he learned Chinese. He was in the diplomatic service, and he later became an ambassador in Japan. He spoke Japanese too, and he played a minor role in what shall I call it? A plan that was set up by a number of Dutch diplomats during the Second World War to get Polish Jews out of Europe by way of Japan. So Polish Jews through Europe, they crossed all the way through the Soviet Union, and they crossed over by sea to Japan. And at this point, Japan was not persecuting Jews. There weren't any Jews in Japan anyway. They hardly even knew what Jews were. So they were actually safe in Japan. And Japan, at one point, mainly at the insistence of Germany, which Japan was already allied with, moved them to Japanese-occupied Shanghai. So these Jews actually ended up in Shanghai.
Oh my word!
And so this is all connected to, and I've translated a book about this. There's a book coming out from Scribe in early next year, sometime around April, about this, which is going to be called the Just in English. It's an incredible story. But this is connected to Slauerhoff both through Shanghai and through this man von Gulik, who taught Slauerhoff a tiny bit of Chinese. He didn't really know Chinese. The short answer is no, but he knew he learned quite a bit about Chinese literature. And there's actually another big book about Slauerhoff, which is about his Chinese novels and poems and stories. Which is mostly about what he was reading, and it's someone who did a study and reconstructed what his library was at the time and what he must have drawn on. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, and he read it, and a huge number of translate. I mean, and he often read different translations of things too. He often read German and French and English translations of the same Chinese book. If he knew this is a classic, I need to understand this. He actually tried to sort of triangulate that way and get more of a sense of the original. Yeah.
Is any of the scholarship on Slauerhoff in English, or is it pretty much all in Dutch?
It's pretty much all in Dutch. Yeah, there's virtually nothing in English.
Yeah, that's a shame.
Yeah.
Someone say something? No.
I did laugh.
Babette, you try. I keep saying something, and I think you're jumping in.
No, I was just laughing. Sorry, because
Okay.
you said it's a shame.
Well, it is a shame. But I'm thinking, I mean, I know in Britain there are departments of Dutch studies. I've no idea if they teach Slauerhoff, but the uptake, the student numbers must be absolutely tiny in Britain. So
I can say that I studied Dutch at UCL, and we didn't study Slauerhoff.
No, what did you
But
study?
another year they may have done. We did Helle Haase, Gerard Reeve. We didn't do a huge amount of literature actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in Dutch culture too, it's interesting. They're very proud of their visual tradition and their painterly tradition in particular. So that's a sense in which they feel connected to the past. In literature, I think in some ways there's much more support here for poetry. So it's easier to be a poet in the Netherlands than it is in America or the UK. That's for sure. And in some parts of the country like Friesland, there's an especially strong tradition of that. Or in Flanders, actually, there's a stronger tradition of that.
Yeah, Flanders is even with it. When I taught at Ghent, I taught English literature and cultural studies, but anyone who studied literature in the literature and language faculty, Dutch literature was the norm. So most people did Dutch and English, or Dutch and Spanish, or Dutch and German, or maybe they would do English and Spanish or Chinese or something. But Dutch, I mean, I would say about half the student body doing languages and literature did Dutch literature. It was massive, absolutely massive, and you would expect that because it's a native language.
Yeah, I think among people who read a lot, there's maybe less interest in older books than there is in the UK or in America. That's partly because the language has changed quickly. So it's harder to read a book from around 1930 in Dutch than it is in English. The language is more different.
Good Lord, that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Babette, why has the language changed so much? Do you know?
It's true. I had never been conscious of it, but you're right. It is. I've been reading and translating for partly from fun, Couperus, and that is not that long ago. You know, in comparison to some stuff in England. I mean, I've also read Trollope recently in English, so which is older than Couperus really. Yeah. And Couperus is. He's trying to be modern. I mean, he's certainly not very classical in the way he writes. It's very imaginative and lively, but it is weird in comparison to how I describe things now. Yes.
And the spelling's been reformed a number of times, but even if you modernize the spellings, they're just that, there are some pronouns that are different. There are case endings that are no longer in the language. So that's a real barrier to reading older books.
Could we maybe say, maybe we could also say that the society has changed more than here? I mean, that sounds like a ridiculous, huge thing to say, and maybe that's too blunt a thing to say, but there might be something in it.
There may be something in that.
Yeah. Nina, you had a question.
I was just wondering how you, David, then if the language was so, or felt, would feel antiquated reading in the Dutch, but certainly reading the excerpt we saw, I wondered how you dealt with it. I think you just
Yeah, I don't I don't think Slauerhoff in his poems sometimes Slauerhoff has a more old-fashioned style, so he's respecting kind of formal traditions more. In the prose, I think you see there is this push to write in a modern way, and Slauerhoff was actually he was known as he had this reputation for being sloppy. There's this he's
Mhm.
word slordig is really, which means sloppy, is really associated with his name in Dutch. And he was sloppy in a lot of ways. He was sloppy with his correspondence, and he was sloppy in the way he dressed himself, and he was sloppy in keeping up with his friends and in social forums and in all kinds of ways. He wasn't sloppy as a writer at all. He was very careful. He revised and revised and revised, and every word that's in the book is there, because he wanted it there. But it looked sloppy to people because he had this different aesthetic that he was working, and I think that's where the influence of um, the beginnings of modernism and also of Asian translations from Asian literature come into it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I'm amazed that Dutch has changed so much in the fabric of the language itself, because in English it's mood, tone, the cultural values have changed, but the words, the syntax, I mean, you can read Trollope now without even thinking. It's completely, Trollope is modern English. Some of
Yeah.
the words might be more, the tone is more formal, but my word, just thinking about Dickens as well. Gosh.
Yeah, this actually came up when we were working on War and Turpentine too, Kate, because there are passages in that where and that's that a lot of that novel takes place around the First World War, and there's a place and there are parts where clearly the style of that era is being evoked. The Dutch has a kind of early 20th century feel to it.
Yeah.
But in English, what is an early 20th century feel? I mean, if you read the writers Siegfried Sassoon or Robert Graves, these British writers who wrote about their First World War experiences, they
Yeah.
sound very modern in a lot of ways, and the differences are subtle.
Yeah. And there's class-based difference as well as education-based difference. And Sassoon and Blunden they would have studied Greek and Latin at school, and they would have based their formal tone on the Greek and on the classics. But I was thinking, what I was doing with Orlog and Turpentine, I was weeding out anachronisms a lot of the time, and also preventing Americanisms from creeping in, because you were using First World War Americanisms for things like military kit or for rank, and I was knowing, no, we have to make this Anglophone English, not an American English translation. That was very interesting, the way that evolved.
Yeah, yeah, that was fascinating. Yeah.
Are there any other questions then? I think we're approaching the end of our allotted hour, because nobody can do a Zoom meeting for more than 1 hour without needing a very stiff drink. Are there any other questions?
I have a question if no one else does.
Do.
I was just wondering, with an Irish protagonist and in a Chinese setting, is there much in the novel that you think is characteristically Dutch?
I think the fact that the book is so international is actually characteristic of a lot of Dutch writing, and it's a shame in a way that what's easier to sell, I think, and what's easier to sell to publishers certainly, and maybe to the public too, is books that have a certain national character. This is a Dutch book, and it's about a Dutch setting, and people are ice skating or whatever it is. When people read a book in translation, they want to learn something about the culture it comes from, the place. And whereas some of the most interesting Dutch books, I think, throughout history and now, and this applies to Flemish literature too, have been are books about where a Dutch person is writing about someone from another European country who's visiting somewhere in Asia, just like this book. And I'm translating a play now by a recent play by a Flemish playwright about the refugee crisis, and it takes place in 4 countries, none of which are Belgium. So there are no Flemish characters in it. And there are 5 languages spoken in the book. There's 5 languages spoken in the play, except they're all rendered as Flemish. So it's a play. You hear all the characters speaking Flemish and then in the translation English to one another. But they're actually characters who would be speaking 5 different languages in real life. So it's this it doesn't tell you anything about life in Flanders or Flemish culture. But I think what's Dutch and Flemish about it is that it has always been this very international, mercantile part of the world. It's been a very outward-looking country all the time, connected to other places. It was a colonial power, so it has that tradition as well. So that I think that maybe the internationalism is actually the most Dutch thing about it.
Yeah. But I think Slauerhoff's choice of Irish for his narrative voice's identity, his nationality, is completely random, because it could as well be Scottish, could be Welsh, could be American, could be French, because there is nothing about Ireland, nothing about. He mentions once, possibly twice, Belfast, comparing a street scene in Belfast to a street scene he was part of, but nothing is made of it. It could be anywhere. So I really think it was just grab a nationality that's not Chinese, not Dutch. I think that was his intention.
Yeah, and maybe someone who's not from a large country, who's also from a smaller country.
Yeah.
And what may have played a role also is that he was Frisian, Slauerhoff.
Okay.
And he saw, as Frisians tend to, I mean, they see themselves as having this very long lineage going back to pre-Christian tradition. So Frisians are proud of being part of this ancient culture, being having this long heritage. And I think so. Ireland may have appealed to him for that reason, that he saw the Celtic heritage as being a connection to pre-Christian traditions. So someone who wasn't necessarily as tied to modernity in that way. I mean, I think he saw Christianity as part of the European culture he didn't want to have taking over the world. You know, he was part of what he feared about European cultures. Christianity was for him of a piece with kind of neo-colonialism and industrial expansion and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.